Hi everybody, I'm Beebs Kelley. Welcome back to another video. When Harry and Meghan participated in this super weird interview for CBS Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley, I'll link the videos for you here and in the description box, it came off really the same way that everything the Sussexes do. Ill-prepared. Their brand is consistently inconsistent and ill-prepared. That's their real brand. But that didn't get a ton of attention at the time because it's so standard for them that they seem so last minute and rushed in everything they do. It all seems ill thought out, like they didn't have time to prepare anything. They didn't seem ready for the interview. Even the answers that were clearly scripted, the bad acting is so very see-through, it still didn't seem like they were ready for it. And their vibes with each other seemed a bit weird too. Well, a new theory and new rumors have explained why. Now, this is a big part of why there's so many mistakes in the things that they do because it's not well enough organized and studied beforehand. Despite Meghan Markle's claims to be a complete control freak and very detail-oriented, I do not believe it for 1 second. But it's clear now why they did this. With their desire to continue to pretend to be part of the royal family, which they quit and assaulted and complained about for years, super weird in and of itself, they announced they'd be visiting Colombia because they want to do more of these faux royal situations because it makes them feel more important, it gives them validity in their eyes, and they probably think that it gives more legitimacy to like Archwell and stuff so they can try to get more donations and things like that, probably. But they needed a reason for this trip. Because without a reason, it's skirting too close to that boundary established with the royal family and the Sandringham Summit that they are not to be trying to continue to be royals. They're not allowed to use the word royal. They're not allowed to use their HRH. No pretending to be royals and doing quasi-royal or faux royal things. That was part of the agreement. And so doing a tour, a trip like this, really approaches that boundary and threatens to step over it. They are just private people here. And that's why Nigeria was marketed, at the beginning at least, as Invictus business. Despite that being heavily disputed, Nigeria was never going to be considered to host the Invictus Games. It was all a farce. But you wouldn't know that it was supposed to be about Invictus anyway because all the press, their press strategy was absolute garbage. It all focused on Meghan. And allowing all the coverage to focus so heavily on her and her antics really undermined the trip and made it clear that it wasn't actually about Invictus at all. That was just the excuse they made so that on paper, they were able to bill everything in terms of security and other stuff to Nigeria, but also it allowed them to not technically step on any royal toes. So for Colombia, they had to have a reason to justify this. Not just to be able to bill everything like security, for example, to Colombia, which is controversial on its own. The government's money, according to public opinion, would be much better spent on their citizens and public services and institutions and keeping the people more safe. But also on paper so that it doesn't create any sort of interference with the Sandringham Summit and all of that. Harry and Meghan had to attach this Colombia visit to something. It couldn't be Invictus, and it couldn't be just a private vacation because they're doing these events that are designed to appear similar to a royal event or tour, which again is another point of controversy we'll get to in a future video. Here's the tea. Colombia is hosting this children's safety conference in the fall, which I discussed with you guys earlier in previous video. It is set to include a bunch of legitimate humanitarian organizations. It is a real and serious conference having its inaugural summit in Colombia. Harry and Meghan applied to host a conversation or a panel spot at this conference, and it was turned down because Harry and Meghan are simply not of the same caliber. This program includes UNICEF, WHO, UNSG, and a whole bunch of other well-respected groups and a slew of experts. It's legit. Archwell and Harry and Meghan were rejected because they are not in the same category of any of these other participants. So this CBS thing, the website of the Parents Network and the interview was rushed out to try to support their application. I took a look at the application. It asks for links to examples of why you think you would be a good contribution to this conference. So this was rushed out to create a reason for this trip. Online child protection concerns, keeping children safe in the online world, cyberbullying, all of that. This was cooked up because Harry and Meghan were not invited anywhere after Nigeria like they thought they would be. They expected to have a bunch of invitations come their way after Nigeria, but it was so tragic and had so many missteps, like having known fugitives from the United States government carting you around and getting pictures with you, making all the press about Meghan and her heritage, tone-deaf situations, inappropriate outfits, all of it. All of the Nigeria trip was actually bad publicity for Meghan Markle and Harry doing any sort of a visit to other countries. So the invitations were not coming through. So the idea was initially that they would apply to be part of this conference and they would show up and do that and create a trip around it, because the conference is only 2 days. So one of the days would be part of the conference and the other days they could do other stuff and pretend to be important, pretend to be royals still, which they're not. But because their application to the conference was rejected on the basis of not being qualified, basically, the rumor is that she wrote the vice president of Colombia to sort of try to appeal this decision and get into this conference, which is super legit, and Archwell is not legit. Vice president has no sway over this global conference for child protection. She's not in charge of it. So instead, this visit was created and rushed to happen now. The timeline of this being so quick was in part to get more publicity, but also because they weren't able to connect it to the conference. And this really expands upon the true motives behind doing this CBS thing and this website. It really was a required part to make the trip make sense to the media, to the public, to the royals, to everybody, to Colombia, to fit the bill, to avoid problems. They met a few of these parents when they interfered with World Mental Health Day last fall. They elbowed in on this panel discussion at this festival that was already happening and met at least some of these parents. This raises a question. Why did they then take nearly a year to launch this little simple website for them to share their story, aka harvest stories for their own use? Why nearly a year later is it only a website? Allegedly, the answer is because it was a last-minute project, all cooked up for this Colombia trip. Meg was trying to leech on to the global conference for child protection taking place in Colombia, and she scurried to put together this website and this video to try to get a spot to host this event or speak at the global conference. Because what better way to try to come across as legit than to speak alongside the WHO and UNICEF? They tried this with UN stuff and it failed tremendously. They really think they're much more important than they are. So the interview was rushed. The website was rushed. That's why it all seemed half-finished and perplexing. It was all just to serve the purpose of trying to get into this conference and justify a trip to Colombia. When it failed, allegedly she reached out, perhaps with her bad, overdone, fussy cursive writing, to the VP and ended up with an invite to tour Colombia instead. And as we can see, they've put on their own faux panel, just like the panel she crashed in Nigeria wearing an inappropriate dress, to further attempt to justify this trip. I guess their formula is show us your culture, let the Meg have a panel she loves, microphones, and bill the host country, regardless of their current financial state. CBS and the Parents Network was simply an attempt to justify their presence at the conference in November, and the last-minute thrown-together Colombia trip now has had to be justified further with this fake panel they put on because they couldn't qualify for the conference. But let me know what you think about this spilled tea, and be sure to subscribe so you do not miss upcoming updates about this trip and all our other content. Now it's time for question of the day. Elizabeth was talking about the CBS interview and the rumor that circulated heavily in the press because one person said it in the media. The idea that Meghan threw a fit after the CBS interview came from social media. It's not sourced at all, and this makes a really good point worth touching on. I personally have not mentioned this alleged fit that she threw because I couldn't find a source, any sort of quote, when I looked into it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it did happen. It's just simply a rumor with no real strong source to back it up. It could have happened, but it also could just be conjecture. It's not a stretch to think that Meghan would have pitched a hissy fit, but the consensus is that Meghan and Harry require all questions to be cleared beforehand, and they have a reputation for being really aggressive about their massive demands, being really difficult to work with, and they're very litigious and controlling. They are wholly about controlling the media coverage of themselves. Like, that's their biggest thing. That's why they've thrown so many tantrums and filed so many lawsuits. So me personally, I find it to be much more likely that she knew about the question, because there's much more evidence and pattern in the long run that all questions would have had to have been approved, or else they wouldn't have seen the light of day. That's a little off topic though. I do think it is important to not just be spreading around things that don't actually have a source or a good amount of cross-referencing and evidence to back it up as likely, because misinformation is annoying. It's always good to remember that news outlets often report on what someone else has said. Like, one commentator says something on a news panel, and then that can become its own news. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's backed up by actual fact. It's a fact that that commentator said it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's just solidly truthful 100% of the time. But let me know what you think about that. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a very happy day ahead, and I will see you next time. Bye.